On the southwestern edge of the Korean peninsula, there is a road that runs in a dead straight line for 33.9 kilometers directly through open ocean, with nothing but the violent Yellow Sea crashing against one side of it and a newly created inland world sitting perfectly calm on the other. This is not a bridge. This is not a causeway balanced on pillars above the water. This is a solid, continuous wall of earth and stone, wide enough in places to carry an entire 8-lane highway across its crown, built to permanently sever the ocean from a stretch of coastline the size of a small country. It took 19 years, roughly $20 billion, and a level of raw industrial defiance rarely attempted anywhere on the planet to complete. This is the Saemangeum Seawall, the longest man-made barrier against the sea in human history. And its story is not one of elegant engineering triumph. It is a brutal, decades-long war against mud, tides, and the ocean's own violent memory of the land it used to own. The story begins in 1991, when the South Korean government looked at the southwestern coastline near the industrial port city of Gunsan and identified a problem that had nothing to do with bridges or towers. South Korea is a small, mountainous country with shockingly little flat, usable land, and by the early 1990s, the government had become fixated on a singular, almost obsessive goal: manufacturing new land out of nothing. Off the coast near Gunsan lay one of the richest tidal flat ecosystems in all of East Asia, a vast, shifting expanse of mudflats fed by two major rivers, the Mangyang and the Dongjin, where the tide would rise and fall by as much as 6 meters twice a day, exposing and reclaiming hundreds of square kilometers of soft, nutrient-rich sediment in an endless natural rhythm. The Korean government looked at this violently unpredictable natural wonder and decided it was not a wonder at all. It was wasted potential. Their plan was audacious to the point of arrogance. Build a solid wall directly across the mouth of this entire estuary system, permanently locking out the ocean, and transform the reclaimed area behind it into a mixture of agricultural land, freshwater reservoirs, and eventually, an entirely new industrial and urban zone. The seawall would need to stretch nearly 34 kilometers, enclosing over 400 square kilometers of land and water, an area larger than the city of Seoul itself. The single greatest enemy standing between the engineers and this impossible ambition was not the tide, and it was not the currents. It was the seabed itself. Unlike a typical coastal construction site sitting on firm sand or bedrock, the ground beneath Saemangeum's tidal flats was an unstable, semi-liquid nightmare of soft, accumulated mud, in some places extending down 20 meters before engineers ever hit a stable layer of clay capable of supporting the weight of a permanent structure. Mud like this behaves in a deeply counterintuitive way. It can appear solid enough to walk across at low tide, yet the moment you place significant weight on it, particularly the weight of millions of tons of rock and earth fill, it begins to behave almost like a liquid, deforming, squeezing sideways, and threatening to swallow anything built on top of it whole. Before a single boulder could be dropped into the water, marine geologists had to conduct an exhaustive seabed survey across the entire 34-kilometer route, drilling core samples to map exactly how deep the soft mud extended and where the more stable clay layers began. In many sections, engineers determined that the only viable solution was to physically dredge out the unstable mud entirely, sometimes down to that 20-meter depth, hauling it away with specialized dredging vessels before a single stone of the actual seawall foundation could be laid. This single phase of the project, invisible to anyone driving across the finished structure today, consumed years of effort and represented one of the largest dredging operations ever undertaken for a coastal engineering project anywhere in the world. Once a stable foundation trench had been cleared down to workable clay, the actual body of the seawall began to rise using what engineers call a fill-up construction method, an approach that sounds deceptively simple but concealed an enormous logistical war being fought against the tide itself. Massive fleets of dump trucks and barges hauled dredged sea sand, crushed rock, and quarried stone to the site continuously, dumping load after load to slowly build up an embankment from the seabed toward the surface. But the Yellow Sea at Saemangeum was not a passive construction site. It was an active battlefield. The tidal range here regularly exceeded 5 to 6 meters, meaning that twice a day colossal volumes of water surged in and out of the widening gaps in the still unfinished seawall, generating currents powerful enough to physically move boulders across the seabed as if they were loose gravel. Every single day, engineers were racing against a clock dictated by the moon, working furiously during slack tide windows when the currents briefly calmed, only to watch the ocean surge back through the gaps hours later and test everything they had just built. Standard riprap, the loose armor stone typically used to stabilize embankments against wave action, was simply not heavy enough or stable enough to survive these currents in the critical final closure sections, where the gap between two advancing sections of embankment had narrowed and the water was forced to accelerate through an increasingly tight bottleneck, exactly like a thumb placed over the end of a garden hose. This narrowing gap problem became the single most dangerous and technically demanding phase of the entire project, and it is where the engineers behind Saemangeum pioneered one of their most important innovations, the large-scale use of gabion technology to defeat the ocean's own hydraulic fury. A gabion, in its simplest form, is nothing more than a rectangular wire mesh cage filled with loose rock. But at the scale used in Saemangeum, these became colossal engineered units, massive rock-filled bags lowered by crane and specially designed to interlock with one another and resist being dragged away by even the most violent tidal surge. As the embankments advanced from both directions toward the final closure points, engineers gradually raised the height of the seabed sill across the full width of each remaining gap, using a combined vertical and horizontal closure technique. Trucks rumbled to the water's edge in a constant, relentless convoy, dumping rock and then dropping these massive gabion units directly into the narrowing channel, layer by layer, fighting to raise the sill faster than the accelerating current could wash the material away. The final and most extreme of these closures involved sealing two separate 2.7-kilometer gaps simultaneously, a coordinated, multi-front assault where engineering crews worked on both closure points at once, racing against the tidal clock to prevent one gap's rapidly changing hydraulics from destabilizing progress at the other. When the last of these closures was completed in April of 2006, the Yellow Sea had, for the first time in geological history, been physically cut off from an estuary it had shaped for millions of years. With the outer wall finally sealed along its full 33.9-kilometer length, the project shifted from a battle against tidal currents into an entirely different kind of engineering challenge, the slow, methodical transformation of an active seabed into dry, usable land. The area now enclosed behind the seawall was still, for all practical purposes, an ocean. It remained flooded with seawater, still connected hydraulically to the rivers feeding in from inland, and still covered in soft, saturated mud, completely unsuitable for construction or agriculture. Engineers began an enormous pumping operation, using industrial drainage systems to slowly draw down the water level inside the enclosure, exposing the seabed to open air for the first time in its history. But simply exposing wet mud to sunlight does not create usable land. It creates a treacherous, semi-liquid hazard that can take years to solidify on its own. To accelerate the process and to build a foundation strong enough for future roads, buildings, and farmland, engineers trucked in enormous quantities of sand and soil, spreading it across the drained seabed in a massive continent-scale filling operation designed to raise the elevation of the reclaimed area and give it the structural integrity needed to support the ambitious urban and industrial development planned for its future. Sitting directly atop the crown of the completed seawall itself, engineers built a wide multi-lane roadway, transforming what began purely as a flood barrier into a functioning piece of national transportation infrastructure now designated as part of South Korea's National Route 77. Driving along this road today produces one of the strangest visual experiences in modern infrastructure. On one side of the vehicle, the open, wild, violently churning Yellow Sea stretches to the horizon exactly as it always has. On the other side, a completely artificial landscape of shallow freshwater reservoirs, developing industrial parks, and the early skeleton of a planned smart city rises out of what used to be open ocean. The seawall itself is not a thin barrier. At its widest points it reaches nearly 535 meters across, wide enough to be considered a landform in its own right, rather than a mere structure, and it rises as high as 54 meters at its tallest sections, roughly the height of an 18-story building, standing between the reclaimed interior and the raw power of the Yellow Sea. Perhaps the most technically sophisticated ongoing element of the entire Saemangeum system is not something visible from a passing car at all. It is the massive network of automated steel sluice gates embedded within the seawall itself, primarily concentrated at two major control points. These gates function as the barrier's nervous system, constantly regulating a delicate hydrological balancing act between the outside tidal ocean and the enclosed inland water body. Because the reclamation area still receives continuous freshwater inflow from the Mongyang and Dongjin rivers, engineers cannot simply seal the enclosure permanently. The internal reservoir must be periodically flushed and rebalanced to prevent catastrophic flooding from upstream rainfall. while also carefully managing salinity levels for the developing agricultural and aquaculture zones inside. Sensor-driven monitoring stations continuously track water levels and tidal predictions on both sides of the wall, automatically triggering the opening and closing of these colossal steel gates to release excess internal freshwater during low tide windows when the pressure differential is most favorable, and sealing tightly again as the external tide rises to prevent seawater intrusion. This is not a static wall standing passively against the ocean. It is an active, continuously operating hydraulic machine, making thousands of micro-adjustments every single month to keep an artificial coastline in permanent equilibrium. The ecological cost of this achievement was neither hidden nor accidental. It was the direct, unavoidable consequence of the project's core purpose. The tidal flats that once existed at Saemangeum, ranked among the most productive shorebird habitats anywhere on the East Asian-Australasian flyway, a migratory corridor used by hundreds of thousands of birds traveling annually between breeding grounds in the Arctic and wintering grounds as far away as Australia and New Zealand. Species like the critically endangered spoon-billed sandpiper and the endangered black-faced spoonbill depended on these exact mudflats as an essential refueling stop during their brutal, multi-thousand-kilometer migrations. When the final gates closed in 2006, researchers documented a catastrophic, near-immediate collapse in shorebird populations using the site, and long-term studies found that the vast majority of displaced birds were never able to successfully relocate to alternative habitats elsewhere along the Korean coast. Tens of thousands of local fishers and shellfish harvesters, whose entire livelihoods depended on the tidal flats' rich clam and shellfish beds, similarly lost their traditional way of life almost overnight, their fishing grounds transformed permanently into dry land or brackish freshwater reservoirs. Today, nearly 2 decades after the seawall's final closure, the reclaimed territory behind it remains very much a work in progress. A slow, ongoing transformation from raw, drained seabed into a functioning modern landscape. Large sections are still designated for future development, earmarked by the South Korean government for next-generation renewable energy installations, sprawling industrial complexes, and an ambitious vision for a futuristic urban expansion zone intended to relieve pressure on South Korea's overcrowded major cities. The Saemangeum Seawall stands today as an almost paradoxical monument, simultaneously the longest continuous man-made barrier ever constructed against the sea, and one of the most contested pieces of infrastructure in modern Korean history, a physical manifestation of a nation's willingness to spend $20 billion and 19 years fighting mud, tides, and the ocean itself, permanently redrawing where the land ends and the sea begins.
So how does this part protect the city during a storm surge?
The floodgates close automatically when the water reaches a certain height.
All right, team, the inspection is complete.
Yep, fine.
Roger that, we're all packed up here.
The integrated sensor array provides real-time data on structural integrity and water levels. We are Look at this. It says it's the world's longest man-made barrier. Isn't that incredible engineering?